Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session for fall quarter. Um, I will be doing Abraham Lincoln again in the spring. I've gotten after today, I'll be about halfway through the slides that I've made. And there are places for you to ask questions. Feel free to do so. Uh, Grayson will be helping with the questions at the end of the class. Kay Jacobson is sick today and consequently not here. So let's get started. We're going to talk first about the 1860 election. We were talking a good deal about it last week. Today, we're going to talk about the period from the election that Lincoln won up to the inauguration of Lincoln. It's a long wait. There's 4 months here. The election is the first Tuesday in November, but in the 1860s, up until 1936, the president was sworn in on March 4th, not January 20th or 21st, depending on if the 20th fell on a Sunday or not. So a 4-month wait here, but candidates didn't campaign. I mean, you couldn't get around very well. Lincoln was in Illinois. Other presidents were in their home states. They'd get elected, have quite a distance to travel to Washington, D.C. Frequently, they had to travel in horse and carriage, sometimes on a train. Now, you'd think, well, trains are fast. Yes, they are, but there weren't a lot of them in 1860 when Lincoln had to get to Washington, D.C. He might have to go on a horse and carriage for 80 miles until he got to a train depot in Illinois. Then that might get him as far as, say, Ohio, maybe only Indiana. And then he'd have to travel maybe 100 miles to the next train station. So it would take a couple of weeks or several days anyhow. Very long time if you did it by horse and carriage alone. So consequently, this long wait from early November until March 4th, a period of about 4 months. It was changed to January 20th in 1936, as I've stated. And if the 20th, when the president is sworn in, is on a Sunday, then it goes to the 21st. This is because there were lots of people in church back in those days. Today, we're down to about 18% of the US population is in church on any given Sunday. It was a much, much higher percentage in the 1860s. So what's interesting about this is that Sunday church, Christian in origin. Now, the United States has constitutional requirements about separation of church and state. Then you also have the issue about what about Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, any other religious group, Sikhs. This is what a lot of people call a shallow values approach. You know, everybody should be in church. And the exclusion, of course, was a concern to lots of people. During this 4-month wait period, Southern states began to secede. The Confederacy was formed. Jefferson Davis was going to be the president of it. United States forts across the South were taken over by the Confederacy. So here you have the far southern states here. These are slave states all the way from Virginia, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri and south. This is Mississippi down here. So you got lots of states, and many have seceded. U.S. forts in the South were seized. This is now during the lame duck period of the presidency of James Buchanan, pictured here. He did nothing during this 4-month period to stop secession, to do something about forts being seized. His concern was, this is for Lincoln to deal with. It's his problem. So for 4 months, nothing gets done. Well, the South is seceding and U.S. forts are being taken over. This is the reason that James Buchanan has regularly been evaluated by historians at the bottom of the presidential list. He's been at the bottom. Generally, he's about third or fourth from the bottom. And it's because of his lack of response to the secession of states and the formation of the Confederacy and the taking over of U.S. forts in Confederate states. Here is these evaluations that are done. There's about 140 presidential historians involved in these evaluations. And you can see here, this is the top 10 presidents. You can see Franklin Roosevelt has generally been listed since 1982 as the most favorable president by these 140 historians. You can see Lincoln recently here is second, Washington is third, Teddy Roosevelt, Jefferson, Eisenhower, very high, sixth, Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy, Madison are in the top 10. So now at the bottom, here 1982 to the present, Franklin Pierce is the winner for being at the bottom. And Pierce was president 1853 to 57. There was lots he could have been doing about slavery and the South, and he did very little. The separation between North and South was increased dramatically during his term as president. He's ranked at the bottom for these presidents. You can see here's Buchanan, third from the bottom, fourth from the bottom now during the last 20 years. They do these evaluations every 4 to 8 years. You can see here 82 to 90, then 94, then 2002, 2010, 18, then 22. So you got some 8-year periods, some 4-year periods when the evaluations are done. These evaluations were started by Arthur Schlesinger Sr., a historian and college professor, and taken up by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. When his father retired. They started the surveys. When Arthur Schlesinger Jr. died, Siena College took over here, this Siena, S-I-E-N-A. They took over doing this, and they do it regularly now. It was very haphazard. Also, when Siena College took over, they had all these college professors who were ranking the president. They had them ranking on 20 different subject areas. We'll talk about that in a minute. On your left is Arthur Schlesinger Sr., who started these presidential evaluations, and his son, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., on the right, who was also a college professor, but was an aide to John F. Kennedy during the Kennedy presidency. And again, now done by Siena College. You can type in on your computer, Siena College presidential rankings, and you'll get a list of all of this stuff from years gone by. and you'll get a list of all 20 of the categories that they evaluate in. Good. Lincoln's plan for the presidency. We're going to take a look at 4 items here. Some of the things that are evaluated by these historians is intelligence, likability, foreign policy, and there's 20 of these things altogether. So Lincoln is the first Republican elected to the presidency. Party was founded in 1854. They ran John C. Fremont in 1856. He lost to James Buchanan. But now Lincoln is elected, first Republican president. What are his policies? They look very much like a lot of the old Whig ideas, the party that now had crumbled, fallen apart, and Republicans have become the second major party with the Democrats in the United States. So, what does Lincoln want? A modern banking system. He wants a bank run by the federal government. This means lots of ties to the U.S. business culture. The Republican Party has been very much involved with business from its very founding, when business corporations were really getting up and started in the United States. And during the latter third of the 1800s, we saw the growth of corporations, and of course, they're giants economically and with political influence today. If there was a very large federally run bank, and it could be supporting privately run, also very large banks, this would mean a lot more money in these large banks. This would make loans much easier for corporations to get from these banks, as opposed to smaller little state and local banks. So Lincoln's major first is, let's grow the banking system, and let's have a federally run bank also. Growing business culture. During Lincoln's time, the growth was primarily in textiles, and these folks in this factory are making cloth. Now, the cloth would be sold, and then clothing would be made by the female head of the household. She would make clothing for the children, etc. Eventually, of course, the cloth would be made into clothing by corporations and purchased accordingly, and it no longer became a requirement of females to provide clothing for their families. Second item, Lincoln's plan for the presidency: federal funding of internal improvements. You may remember from early in these lectures, Lincoln was running for local office in Illinois, and he was in the Springfield area. Sangamon River runs through that area, and his campaign in that local election was to improve the Sangamon River for navigation. And now here, as president, he's saying, we want more roads, more canals, better rivers, any government funding of privately owned railroads, which occurred, gigantic amounts of money paid to railroads to lay their tracks with, $16,000 a mile in the 1860s for flat land, $32,000 a mile for hilly land, $48,000 a mile for tunnels. These are gigantic amounts of money in 2024 dollars and by inflation. So banking improvements, improvements in getting goods to markets. roads, canals, railroads, etc. Expansion of urban areas was also a major policy of Lincoln's. This is in violation of Jefferson's need to say, we need to have rural people. They need to be farmers. That's what democracy has to be based on. They need to own land, etc. Now we have a president who's saying we need to grow the urban population. That's where corporations are located, is in urban areas and cities. Urban areas on this chart are considered to be cities of 25,000 or greater. Now here's Lincoln. When he took office, we were at about 17, 18% urban. But when he left office, we're at about 24, 25% urban. And you can see the growth up to 2010 here, where we were now 80% urban. It's now estimated that we may be as low as about 4% rural, but that's the percent of the population that owns farms is about 4%. There are a lot more people living in cities of 25,000 or less. So we're probably still right around that 80% figure. But you can see the immense growth of urban areas based frequently on the rise of corporations who needed employees settled nearby the plant that they were working at, and that created very large villages and cities. Item number 4, he wanted tariffs on imported goods. The federal government had no way to get money. Income taxes were outlawed in the Constitution. So how do we fund the federal government? We can do it by taxing goods that come into the United States from other countries. Federal government gets that tax. And it increases the price on foreign goods, thereby protecting U.S. businesses who can't make these foreign goods as cheaply as large nations can, like England and France, etc. There's no income tax till 1913. It took a constitutional amendment. Frequently, Woodrow Wilson gets blamed for starting the income tax because it took effect in 1913. The fact is, the amendment was passed by Republican Congress during the presidency of Republican William Howard Taft, 1909. That got approved by enough states in 1913 when it started. But income tax was a Republican notion and accomplishment from 1909 to 1913. Lincoln's plan, 4 major concerns: modern banking system, internal improvements, roadways, larger banks is what he wanted. Internal improvements, rivers, roads, canals, etc. Expand urban areas, which Lincoln did dramatically, probably from about 17, maybe up to 25%. And tariffs so that the federal government could have some money to work with. Note, Lincoln's plan for the United States presidency, nothing about slavery is included. Lincoln's plan, a related book. We talked about this book, I think maybe during the second lecture that I did, but I'm going to remind you of it here again. This is Jeffrey Williamson's late 19th century American development. It's about the rise of corporations from the end of the Civil War to 1900. and it's about the economic development. He took a look at all the economics during that latter third of the 19th century, and he put them into a computer, and he ran the computer, and he was only off by a couple percentage points about the growth of the economy in the United States during that 35-year period there, end of the Civil War to 1900. So he thought, well, this will be interesting. He made some corrections, got it a little better, and then he took out the railroads. He said, okay, the railroads aren't going to be delivering goods. Took the railroads out, ran the program, got the same results. Railroads made no economic difference. Goods still got to market. It just took longer. What took longer was you had to deliver it by horse and cart, not by railroads. Interesting. The beard of Lincoln's. Let's talk about that. I'm going to read one lengthy letter to you and then a short one from Lincoln. The letter was written by this woman shown here as an adult. She was 11 years old when she wrote the letter to Lincoln, and it was after the election but before the inauguration. And she talks about getting people to vote for Lincoln. And she wanted Lincoln to grow a beard. And it was during this time that Lincoln grew his beard. And it was a result of this 11-year-old girl writing this letter. Dear Sir, my father has just home from the fair and brought home your picture and Mr. Hamlin's. Hamlin was Lincoln's vice president nominee. I am a little girl, only 11 years old, but want you should be president of the United States very much. So I hope you won't think me very bold to write to such a great man as you are. Have you any little girls about as large as I am? If so, give them my love and tell her to write to me if you cannot answer this letter. I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway. And if you let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you. You would look a good deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. My father is going to vote for you, and if I was a man, I would vote for you too. But I will try to get everyone to vote for you that I can. I think that a rail fence around your picture makes it look very pretty. I have got a little baby sister. She is 9 weeks old and is just as cunning as can be. When you direct your letter, direct to Grace Bedell, Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York. We're going to talk about this county. I must not write any more. Answer this letter right off. Goodbye, Grace Bedell. Lincoln wrote back to her, Miss Grace Bedell, my little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affection if I were to begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. When Lincoln traveled from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., he stopped in Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York, to meet personally Grace Bedell. He had grown a beard at this time. And this is a statue in Westfield, New York, of the greeting of Grace Bedell with Abraham Lincoln. here are the letters. This is the back of the letter that Grace Bedell wrote to Lincoln. And this is Lincoln's entire letter that he wrote back to the 11-year-old girl in the state of New York. So such things have been preserved. I want to do a side note here and talk to you about the importance of Chautauqua County in New York. There was a clergyman in Chautauqua County in 1874, and he said, we ought to have a weekend here where people can just go hear some lectures by politicians and college professors, also see some circus performers, etc., and just have a fun weekend during the summer months somewhere. So this is where these Chautauqua institutions started. They ended up spreading across the entire United States. My father grew up in Dumont, Iowa, a town of 800 people. They had a weekend Chautauqua. There were people that would form these Chautauquas, and they would move from small town to small town across states like Iowa and entertain the people for a weekend or a couple of weekdays in the evenings and so on. Matamidi, Minnesota, now that's on White Bear Lake. It's a town associated with St. Paul and Minneapolis, large populations. They didn't run a weekend festival. They ran a festival that lasted all summer long, with people coming in from areas around Minnesota, Illinois, etc., or from around Minnesota to this Matamidi convention. This is Wildwood Park in Matamidi. I wrote a history of Matamidi, by the way. Now, this is the same as Excelsior Park was, way out on Lake Minnetonka. And the reason that the streetcar companies built Excelsior Park and Wildwood Park is they didn't have any business on weekends. People had weekends off. They could now travel to these parks on the far ends of town by taking streetcars. Streetcars ended up having more business on weekends as a result of the streetcar-owned Wildwood Park and Excelsior Park on radical ends of the Twin Cities. Now, in addition to Wildwood Park and Matamidi, they had a Chautauqua Assembly Building. See how permanent it is? They had an area where they had lots and lots of cabins. People could come in from areas all around Minnesota, Wisconsin, etc., and stay in these cabins. Or they could bring a tent. They had a large open area, and there would be hundreds of tents there. And this building held 2,500 people. People as famous as William Jennings Bryan spoke at these Chautauquas. So famous people would come in. The stunning thing about the Twin Cities is up on the lake, White Bear Lake in Matamidi, they had a Chautauqua that lasted all summer long. This is the Chautauqua Park today in Matamidi. The buildings have all been lost, torn down, but the word Chautauqua is remembered. Okay, preservation of the Union. Lincoln's major concern. Let's take a look at it. Lincoln, his purpose of the Civil War was preservation of the Union. Hey, I always used to have students, I'd give them 5 extra points if they could find a mistake. And this is when I was using overheads. Now, did anybody notice? There's a quote mark there, but not here. See? Uh, Lincoln's major concern, preservation of the Union. It's not mentioning slavery. He thought secession immoral, impossible, illegal. You can't do it. And that's why he was fighting the Civil War. Here's from his first inaugural address, 1861. States had seceded in March when he gave this address. Forts had been captured. I'm going to read this famous section of his first inaugural. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of union, and when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. The major portion of this will yet swell the chorus of union. In his inaugural address, he's talking about preservation of the Union. We're going to jump ahead here now to the election of 1864 because it's pretty significant. And then we'll come back and talk about Lincoln's entire presidency. But the election of 1864, lots of Republicans very dissatisfied with Lincoln. He's too soft on slavery. He doesn't mention slavery. He thinks the Civil War is about preservation of the Union. The goal of the Civil War should be the abolition of slavery. So Republicans aren't liking Lincoln. Republican convention was held in Cleveland, Ohio in 1864. Lincoln had no chance of being renominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party nominated John C. Fremont in 1864. Lincoln is now left without a party nomination. And John C. Fremont was a former general in the Army, and he had been their candidate in the 1856 election, the first candidate of the Republican Party. He lost to the Democrat, James Buchanan. 1860, Lincoln the Republican wins. Now it's 1864, and they choose the very strong abolitionist Fremont again to run as their presidential candidate, not Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic Convention, 1864, is divided into two groups. You got the war Democrats. They want the war to continue. They want the South to be conquered. They want the fighting to go on. This has got to be taken care of. And these people need to get back into the Union, and something needs to be done about slavery. Very little, hopefully, according to the war Democrats. Peace Democrats, they want the war stopped. Get out of it. Forget about it. Let the South go their own way. They're going to be a separate nation. That's going to be fine. So the United States might have been two nations, as you see here, divided. Actually, most historians think we would have been divided into about four nations. I want to talk about Utah Territory first. Mitt Romney, a Mormon, was from this area. A lot of people thought this whole area might be a separate nation. Now, the United States was in control of Utah Territory at this time. And Utah was wondering about statehood. Didn't happen till much later. But the United States' concern was you allow polygamy. A man can have more than one wife. We're not going to allow that. You can't do it. Mitt Romney's relatives, as a result, moved to Mexico and stayed there for several decades, and then moved back to Utah Territory, where Mitt Romney was born. Interesting. They moved to Mexico because they could preserve the polygamy that they believed in. and justified because it's all over in the Bible. So the war Democrats win the day. They become the big party. The peace Democrats are just very minimal. And the war Democrats nominate George B. McClellan. He was a general during the Civil War. He was the head general at the beginning of the Civil War. He kept saying, I can't attack anybody. I don't have enough troops. I need more troops. I need more supplies. I need more ammunition and armaments and so on. And Lincoln's telling him, will you please start attacking these Southerners? And finally, Lincoln fires him and really advances Ulysses Grant, who's fighting like crazy out in the western portion of the Civil War along the Mississippi River, especially at Vicksburg. And so the candidate who ends up hating Lincoln because Lincoln fired him is now the major candidate against Lincoln in 1864. He wants the Emancipation Proclamation repealed. It did not abolish slavery. It simply freed slaves in areas that were still under Confederate control on January 1st of 1863. So a lot of people give Lincoln credit for ending slavery. He did not do that. That was done by the Republican abolitionists 8 months after Lincoln was assassinated. So the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves that had not been reconquered by the North, that were still under Confederate control on January 1st, 1863. Freed slaves in Confederate territory. It did not abolish slavery. The war Democrats win the day. Their party platform did call for ending the war, but they wanted to end it by conquest. They'd wondered about negotiating a peace and talked about that, as the peace Democrats had hoped for. Peace Democrats came to be called copperheads because they were so outspoken. Copperhead is a poisonous rattlesnake pictured here. If it bites you, you're in serious trouble. It's a poisonous snake. And these peace Democrats were so outspoken, they were like a viper trying to attack you. So they got the nickname Copperheads. A third party was formed to nominate Lincoln, the National Union Party. So Lincoln is not a Republican in 1864, and during his 1 month before his assassination as the 1864 president, he is a National Union Party member. It's interesting that today the Republicans refer to themselves as the Party of Lincoln. Nope. You got rid of Lincoln in 1864, and he formed a different third party. Here's another one of my famous mistakes that I would make for students to notice. The Party of Lincoln, and notice only one. Here there's two. Only one quote mark there. They rejected Lincoln in 1864. They are the Republican Party. Here's a political cartoon. The Party of Lincoln gave you the right to vote, and the Party of Lincoln can take it away. And this is an elephant talking to Black people. And this is a political cartoon about how Republicans had changed their values considerably, trying to win over Southern states by limiting Black voters. There's an interesting book, Farewell to the Party of Lincoln, Black Politics in the Age of FDR by Nancy J. Weiss. You may be interested in getting a hold of this book and reading it. And it's about the rise of FDR and the Democratic Party after 72 years, with only 16 years of Democratic presidents, 56 years of Republicans. Now this woman writes about FDR stopping that tremendous Republican majority that from 1860 to 1932. Here's the results of the 1864 election. Two major candidates here are Lincoln and George McClellan. Lincoln receives 2.2 million votes, McClellan 1.8 million. This is a 10.2 percentage difference in popular votes. 5% is considered a landslide. This is a super landslide win for Lincoln in 1864, and 55% of the vote, amazing total, especially when you consider his 1860 win was 39.1% of the popular vote, the lowest popular vote percentage for a winning president in United States history. Our least popular president when it came to percent of popular votes in the 1860 election, and a gigantic electoral college win, 212 to 21. He gets 90% of the electoral votes. Why the big win for Lincoln? Well, in the North, it looked like the war was won. 2 months before the election, General Sherman had marched through Georgia and burned the city of Atlanta. So we were making tremendous headways in the South. Sherman was marching all the way to the ocean, and things were looking pretty good. Here's Atlanta in 1864 after Sherman had burned the city, destroyed railroad, what little railroads there were in the South. They had very few. You can see it's just absolutely leveled. Let's take a look at Nagasaki, Japan in 1945. Very similar after the atomic bomb. It took weeks for Sherman. It took minutes for Nagasaki. Here's a comparative photo, 1864, 1945, the two photos on the same slide. You can see tremendous destruction. Let's talk about secession next. Lincoln's victory in 1860, South goes totally berserk. We got the Republican Party now with a platform item that says get rid of slavery, abolitionist, even though Lincoln isn't talking like that. They go berserk. Berserker is a Norse or Viking word. I love word origins, and it's means people who fight like a fury in a trance. And berserk became a term for fighting during the Civil War also. Now, states are beginning to secede. The election was Tuesday, November 6th of 1960. We wait 4 months until Monday, March 4th, and Lincoln is sworn in. This is 4 months. Today, we go from the first Tuesday in November to January 21st, 20th, 21st here. It's a couple months. Also, an extraordinarily long period. In Britain, the day after the election, a new prime minister takes office. The new parliament is sworn in 5 days after the election. Why the wait, in the United States? People say, well, there's things that need to be accomplished and so on. You got to pick a cabinet. as if a lot of that hadn't been discussed already. Anyway, um, it's interesting. Still a lengthy period. We're in the middle of this dead area now, where there's going to be a whole new Congress and so on. So 20 December 1860, this is like 6-7 weeks after the election of 1860 in November. South Carolina secedes from the Union. Here's South Carolina on the map of the US. Here's a close-up map of South Carolina. It is the first state to secede from the Union, and it does so over the slavery issue, over the election of Abraham Lincoln, over concerns about what Northerners might attempt to do in the next Congress with slavery. By the time Lincoln takes office, February, this is in February of 1861, he takes office on March 4th. 7 states have seceded. I call them 7 slime states. And they are Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. After Lincoln takes office and the war begins, 4 more states, making a total of 11 in total, secede. Those 4 others are Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Look here, here's Virginia, here's West Virginia. West Virginia didn't exist at this time. West Virginia seceded from Virginia in 1863. It was a lot of people that were opposed to slavery there. And it became a part of the Northern Union of the United States in the middle of the Civil War. Interesting side note, Jefferson wanted all these states along the coast to own all the land as you went westward. So look at Tennessee. See, they would have gotten all of this land and then down this little strip all the way across here. Look at Virginia. Jefferson was in Virginia. They'd have gone all the way from this point up here to this point down here, a huge margin all the way across. Then, middle of the Civil War, West Virginia secedes. Now, if Jefferson's plan were put into effect, look at a little tiny slit that they would have running all the way across the US. Anyhow, interesting. So these are the states that form the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis becomes president, and the war begins, and it begins up here off the coast at Fort Sumter, fort out on an island in the Atlantic Ocean. The Crittenden Compromise. This was December 1860. This is an attempt in the Congress to get things settled between the North and the South. It has 7 provisions. We're going to take a look at all 7 of them. First of all, slavery cannot exist in any U.S. territory north of 36 degrees, 30 minutes. Look at here. This line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes. It starts at the border of Missouri here and stretches then to the top of the Texas Panhandle and all the way to California. You can have slavery down here in territories. You cannot have slavery up here in U.S. territories. Quite a bit of land where that would be slave-free compared to land that would be slave-oriented. All African slaves south of 36 degrees, 30 minutes, the same line, will be forever slaves. So you can never gain your freedom ever, according to the Crittenden Compromise. States admitted to the Union get to vote on slave or free. This is known as popular sovereignty. There were a lot of people, including Southerners, who wanted a state comes into the Union and it's a free state, then you have to have a slave state come in also. Free state, slave state, free state, slave state, until there's as many states as the US might have. So you maintain a balance, same number of slave states as free states. So the South did not like this item at all. People might vote and there'll be more free states than there are slave states. Popular sovereignty was an issue the Confederacy did not like, but it was part of this Crittenden Compromise. Fourth, slavery may never be abolished in the United States. Again, protecting the South, an attempt to get the South to come back into the Union, these states that had seceded. Slavery must be allowed in all present slave states. It must be allowed in all US properties and all military forts. This all military forts is a reaction. 2 years earlier, the 1858 Supreme Court of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott lived for 3 years with his master, a medical doctor in the military at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, and then sued for his freedom, which was declared that he could not do by the United States Supreme Court. So here, this Crittenden Compromise, 2 years later, is saying slavery can exist in all military forts, even if they're in the North. A fifth item, slavery must be allowed in Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. becomes a slave area. It had, according to this, must be allowed there. It already was. And there were lots of slave auctions in Washington, D.C. There were presidents who were concerned about slavery in Washington, D.C., and they would bring in slaves and have them work in the White House, slaves that they had held in Virginia, and then they'd move them out and bring 6 others in. They were concerned if they stayed too long in Washington, D.C., they might be declared free. Anyhow, due to this concern over what was the status of Washington, D.C., Crittenden, in his compromise document that he's presenting to the Senate and the House of Representatives, says that slavery must be allowed in Washington, D.C. So the slave states, sixth item, slave trade must be allowed in all states. So you can have state auctions even in free states. Slavery is allowed everywhere in terms of trade of slaves, even in free states. Seventh, fugitive slaves, that's slaves who have run away from their owners in the South, must be compensated for by the United States Congress to the previous owner. So you own a slave and it runs away, you can apply to the US Congress and be compensated for that slave. These were not small amounts of money. Slaves were selling for between $1,200 and $2,000 in 1860 currency. So a tremendous amount of money. Here's a $10 bill from the 1860s with a portrait of Lincoln on it. These bills were much larger than they are today. Today, a bill is about this size, 2/3 the size of the bill that you see here. So 7 items. This is John Crittenden, who introduced these items. It's known as a Crittenden Compromise because he's trying to stop the Civil War, which is in its very early threats here in December of 1860. He was from Kentucky, which was a slave state, hence several of the items in the compromise that deal with protecting slavery, establishing slavery, like in Washington, D.C., talking about how slavery can be advanced as more states come into the Union. This bill failed in both houses of Congress, so nothing ever came of it. Lincoln was outraged at this proposal, spoke out against it, didn't like it one bit. Here's a drawing of Lincoln outraged with his pet birds. The Corrin Amendment, another item in our approach to the Civil War. Remember, you can go to questions and answers if you have any questions, answers, etc. Please feel free to do so. We'll begin talking about those in 20 minutes or so. Corrin Amendment. This is Thomas Corrin. He was a member of the House of Representatives from the state of Ohio, which is a free state. So he's in the North. And this Corwin Amendment, it's called an amendment because it was a constitutional amendment. And it says Congress may not interfere with slavery. So Congress could not take a vote that said, we're going to abolish slavery. They couldn't do anything about slavery, according to the Corwin Amendment. So this protects slavery. And he introduces it as a constitutional amendment. And here's the text of it. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of such state. So the Corwin Amendment, it's a constitutional amendment proposal that will establish slavery in the states and make it a states' rights issue, and Congress can do nothing about what states say concerning slavery. Congress may not interfere with slavery. Lincoln stated he had no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. Again, Lincoln's compromise position on slavery. We talk about Lincoln as if he was the guy that freed slaves, certainly started talking by the end of the Civil War in those tones, but here he's really, throughout most of his life, he's a compromise political candidate on slavery. It passed both houses of Congress. It is then sent out to the states for approval, and it never got approval of enough states. So it never became a constitutional amendment. Slavery is not established in the states where it already exists. Congress can now interfere with slavery. This amendment did not become a law. Now, Lincoln has to travel from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. He's been elected president. He's going to be living at the White House now for 4 years. So we're going to talk about his travel to Washington, D.C. It's February 11th of 1861. It's 2 months and a week after the election. Lincoln leaves Springfield, Illinois for his inauguration, which will be about 3 weeks off. The inaugural address and his swearing in is March 4th. Major concern of this travel period is Lincoln's safety. A lot of conflicts with slavery. States have seceded. We need to protect Lincoln on this voyage, although it's not on water, but his crossing of the United States from Illinois to Washington, D.C. Secret Service was founded on July 5th of 1865, so there's no Secret Service in 1861 when Lincoln's traveling. And even once it was founded in 1865, it was part of the Department of Treasury and was used to look over Treasury items. It really was involved in the economics of the United States, the importation of goods. It wasn't until the assassination in 1901, the third president to be assassinated in 35 years, that the Secret Service maintained or was given an added responsibility of guarding presidents and later guarding presidential candidates. But it was created basically to find people who were counterfeiting U.S. money. So it wasn't until 1901 that we saw the guarding of presidents beginning. William McKinley had been assassinated, third president murdered in 36 years. Finally, it was decided presidents needed to be guarded. Here's Obama with 3 security agents. They sunglasses make it look pretty important. There was a bill in 1906 that started funding these guards, even though they were started in 1901. So the funding of the guarding of presidents was passed under Theodore Roosevelt in a bill in 1906. Presidents have been heavily guarded during their presidency, and the bill was extended. Presidents are now guarded after their presidency up until their deaths. So are first ladies. Lincoln was guarded by U.S. Marshals who existed at the time, and this was done during his travel then from Springfield to Washington, D.C. So it was United States Marshals, like, hey, Marshal Dillon, remember that? And then when he got to Washington, D.C., local police began guarding him. U.S. Marshals broke away. Traveling from Illinois to Washington, D.C., Lincoln wore disguises so he couldn't be recognized in carts, most of which were closed up so you couldn't see who was inside anyway. But on a train, he was given a car of his own. He would get on and off stations wearing disguises. The greatest concern was his travel to Washington, D.C. through the slave state of Maryland, where Washington, D.C. is located. See, here is a map of Maryland. Here's Washington, D.C. It was cut out when it was established in late 1700s as the capital of the United States. It was cut out as part of Virginia became Washington, D.C., and a major chunk of Maryland, both slave states. So this red area is Washington, D.C. And look here, a lot of people don't realize it, but Maryland is a panhandle state. Let's take a look at panhandle states just for fun. Look at all of them. Oklahoma here, Florida over here, Nebraska up here, Idaho here, Alaska down here. See all these islands that stretch out. Connecticut up here. It's got this little tiny thing that sticks out down there in the southwest portion. Maryland here with this very large panhandle, and West Virginia, which has one, see, goes across here from 1863. So we have 7 states that are panhandle states. The inaugural address of 1861. Excuse me, taking a drink. Lincoln's inaugural address. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it exists. So he's saying he can interfere with it in new states that come into the Union and in U.S. territories. But here, Lincoln's first inaugural address, I will not interfere with slavery where it already exists. Second, Lincoln thought the major source of the conflict was the issue of the expansion of slavery, not its existence. Northerners were non-expansionists, according to Lincoln, which was his attitude about it. Don't let it expand. The reality is the North really was, they were abolitionists. They didn't want it to exist. Lincoln sees it as a non-expansionist issue. Tons of people in the North, including Republican politicians, see it as an abolitionist issue. Third item, North and South are not enemies to each other. We are one nation. We are friends and pals. We need to remain united. The final major item in Lincoln's 1861 inaugural address is the Union must be preserved, like corn and green beans, so forth. So this is certainly a statement against these southern states that have seceded. It's also a statement protecting the slavery that exists in those states. Peace conference is called in 1861. Let's try to stop this warfare that is burgeoning. It's held in Washington, D.C. It lasts for 2.5 weeks, 18 days, 8th of February to the 25th of February. 100 representatives from U.S. states attend it, and it's led by former President John Tyler, pictured here. He was president from 1841 to 1845. And they reject these Crittenden proposals that we talked about before that were an attempt at a constitutional amendment. They rejected these proposals. Remember, 36 degrees, 30 minutes, slavery may never be abolished, states can vote on slavery. Those were the main 3 points of the Crittenden proposals. They immediately threw those out and wanted to establish their own items. They came up with 2 major components that they were interested in. The southern states that attended said, no, we're not going to rejoin the Union. So they're not rejoining, kind of as is pictured here between a couple. Second major item that they agreed to was northern states and the Republican Party stated that separation from the Union will not be allowed. So southern states are saying we're not going to rejoin the Union. Northern states are saying you have to rejoin the Union. Nothing comes of this peace conference, but yes to rejoining, pictured down here with a couple. So no compromise is reached. Peace conference goes nowhere, comes to no agreement. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. We're going to begin this. We will finish it up winter quarter, which begins in early January. Hope to see you all then. Invite your friends in also. First thing we're going to talk about with the Civil War is states' rights. The South said states should be able to nullify any federal law, which is basically what, the United States Constitution talks about, the Union of States. Well, states that seceded nullified that federal law, that constitutional imperative. So the South wanted any federal law we can get rid of. That's states' rights. Also local politics, not just state politics, cities, counties, so forth. You cannot interfere in local politics at all. Heavy states' rights arguments, still battle cries through, especially right-wing politics. We don't hear that term states' rights so much, but that's basically what's being argued for, is states having the right. Donald Trump says this about abortion. He says, well, states get to decide it. Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, was a proponent of states' rights. That's why the South was voting Democratic throughout much of its history up till the 1960s. So South was a Democratic Party, huge states' rights supporters in the South and among Democrats. Both men died before the Civil War here. Jackson died 15 years before the war started in 1845. John C. Calhoun who was out. I mean, this guy wrote about civil rights. He was a political philosopher, a political theorist, considered a major mind in politics. John C. Calhoun. He died in 1850, 10 years before the Civil War began. And they both argued very heavily for civil rights. You might remember Lake Calhoun, now Lake Bede-Makaska. It was named for John C. Calhoun. The name was changed recently due to his support for states' rights and slavery. And there's lots of arguing today about ending names, especially, and monuments to people who were slavery supporters and big states' rights supporters versus the federal government, especially over the slavery issue. I once heard a Black man speak who stated, don't get rid of these statues and monuments to people who were pro-slavery, pro-states' rights. He said, we need to remember this stuff. But what we can do is put an anti-slavery, pro-federal government memorial or statue of some kind next to these statues of the states' rights slavery supporters, but preserve, because we must remember. Interesting. The South was protecting slavery. It was protecting states' rights. You see items like this published in states' rights websites. 1948, big division. Democrats start to go civil rights, end Jim Crow laws, all that sort of thing. Here's a quote from Hubert Humphrey, who made a speech, this speech, at the 1948 Democratic Party convention. The time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. At the conclusion of Humphrey's speech at the 1948 Democratic Convention, the Southern states walked out of the convention and formed a third party called the Dixiecrat Party. So Humphrey was a major leader beginning in 1948 when he first ran for the US Senate and won that seat here in Minnesota. I spent 3 years setting up 3 museums for famous University of Minnesota graduates. And I did Hubert Humphrey, Roy Wilkins, and Harold Stassen. Here's Hubert Humphrey, US Senator from Minnesota, born in South Dakota, spent a tremendous amount of time interviewing people that were associated with Humphrey. Same with Roy Wilkins. Both Wilkins and Humphrey had died. Their wives were alive. Mrs. Wilkins spent a lot of time talking with me. I went to visit her. They lived in Queens, New York, and he would travel into Manhattan, where the NAACP headquarters were. Born in the city of St. Paul, Roy Wilkins graduated from a St. Paul high school and from the University of Minnesota. And I also set up a museum for Harold Stassen, pictured here. Stassen was still alive. I spent a tremendous amount of time with Stassen. He had a home in Inver Grove Heights where his father had owned a farm that he grew up on, and he owned a home in Philadelphia. I visited. He had documents from his governorship here in Minnesota, and he had documents from he ran for the Republican nomination 10 times for the presidential nomination. And he had a lot of documents for that stuff. So that was very interesting. Working with these folks. The Humphrey family they just would not talk to me. They weren't interested, I guess, for some reason. They wanted it to be something that was created by other people, not created by the biases they might have about their parent, husband, in-law. I found out Hubert Humphrey's daughter was married to a guy that I graduated from Roosevelt High School with. I called him and he went, "Oh yeah, I know who you are." He came over to the Humphrey Institute and he and I had a discussion about Hubert Humphrey, and that was my only contact with Humphrey family members. Anyhow, pretty interesting. And Hubert Humphrey was a guy that really got the United States started on civil rights versus states' rights. And let's do something about Jim Crow laws that have basically extended slavery up to this day, 1948. And Humphrey was instrumental in getting lots of civil rights legislation passed in the 1960s. Find a photo of Hubert Humphrey like the one you just saw. I just typed in Humphrey. Here's the photos I got. Humphrey Bogart. So always type in the first name too, I guess, is the lesson here. Here's Bogart. Everybody wore hats in those days. Here he is with his wife, Lauren Bacall. And there he is smoking a cigarette. The Civil War. Back to reality here. The Civil War, 1861 to 65. We need to stop here, and we'll take up the Civil War during the winter quarter. So let's see if there's questions or not.
We do have some questions, JB. Let's see.
Sorry, I wasn't watching the clock. I should have quit a few minutes ago.
That's
But
okay. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. Let's
okay.
start with one. Why did Lincoln object to the Crittenden Compromise?
Well, yeah, hmm. he was kind of a centrist on slavery. And that Crittenden Compromise was very supportive of slavery and where it existed and its expansion, so forth. So most of those arguments, Lincoln was a non-expansionist for slavery. Uh, and, he was kind of a centrist on the slavery issue. And that's why, he was not in favor of slavery being expanded outside where it existed. He was not in favor of abolishing it until much later in his presidency. That's kind of why the Crittenden document. I don't know. He didn't like it. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see. I think you had a chart earlier in the presentation today about presidential rankings, and one of the viewers is asking where Clinton ranks on that list.
Yeah. Clinton is ranked very high. Um, it's interesting. There's been a lot of controversy about these presidential rankings. Trump is ranked very low, third from the bottom. Should we be ranking presidents should we only rank presidents who have been in office up to 50 years ago? Should we not be ranking current presidents who have left office? Now, the Siena College says we're going to rank all of them up to the present day. So that's what they are doing. But yeah, there are people who argue that, hey, we should rank only 1960 and earlier, you know.
Interesting.
That's political science.
Hmm.
If it's 1960 or later, we can remember it. The fact is, uh, the Siena College and Schlesinger and his father ranked presidents right up to the present day. So that policy is continued.
So another viewer says that they lived in Louisiana for several years and found that there's still sort of the after effects of fighting the Civil War in terms of racism and leftovers from slavery. How do you think that mentality in some of those Southern Confederate states lasts into this modern day?
Yeah, the when I was in college through most of the 1960s, the civil rights movement was very heavy and active. And a common phrase was the South is still fighting the Civil War. And they were fighting it with Jim Crow laws. Uh, so, yes, the Civil War, lots of people in the 60s were saying that the South is still fighting the Civil War. It was 100 years later back then. I think you can still say that, uh, especially about some of the states, Texas in particular. They've transferred a lot of it to Hispanics and illegal immigration, but a lot of it too still concerns blacks. There's still places where black voting has been made very difficult. Black voters have to travel quite a distance to a polling place in many southern states. They don't have cars. Uh, Bus traffic is limited. Um, in North Dakota recently, they passed legislation that said you can't vote unless you have a street address. All Indian reservations in North Dakota have post office box addresses. They immediately started getting street addresses on their reservations. In some places, it took several years before the right to vote was restored for Native Americans in North Dakota. So it isn't just southern states, but yes, the South is still fighting the Civil War in many precincts, in many counties, even in many states. So that phrase is that was popular during the 60s. And I heard it in the 50s too when I was a kid growing up. That's still common use. Yep.
And another
Common
viewer
fact.
is asking to comment on the picture that you had with some of the Chinese workers working on the railroad.
Oh,
Maybe some more history into that.
yeah. Of course, Asian peoples, when they came to the United States, they came in through California, Oregon, and the state of Washington. They didn't come in through New York City and New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina, as Europeans did. So what you had was tremendous Asian nation populations living in California and farming there, a huge farmland that ran from Los Angeles almost all the way up to uh, San Francisco. And they were hired because they were very cheap labor to build the railroads. And they were transported even further into the United States to aid in the building of those railroads into other Western states. So, yeah, there was a treatment of Chinese peoples in the Western United States was very similar to treatment of Black people and people that were former slaves and descendants of slaves as they were treated in the South. And then World War II hit, and we rounded up all people of Japanese ancestry, and they spent about 3 years in camps. Many of those camps have been preserved. They exist all the way from Arizona into Arkansas. Uh, and I used to have come speak in my classes people that were children and had grown up in those 1940s camps. And in the 1960s were in their 30s. They'd come in and speak about life in those encampments. Remember one guy telling a story about the guards at those camps. It was his birthday and everybody was celebrating his birthday. And the guard said, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And he said, "I'd like to walk outside the encampment. Could you open the gates?" And I could walk, it's about 100 yards out to a guardhouse out there with people with rifles in the top story of that guardhouse. And guards let him do it. And he walked down to the guardhouse, walked back into the encampment. The gates were shut, and interesting story. But at any rate, yeah, people of Asian ancestry had the same sorts of treatments by builders of the railroad, by owners of land in those western states, etc. So, yes, end of that story.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the time we're having for today's questions, and I want to plug the OLLI OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute YouTube channel that we have at the University of Minnesota. All of JB's recordings are hosted there, and some of the past presidential series are also available in playlists on the OLLI YouTube channel. So if you just go to youtube.com and search for OLLI University of Minnesota, that channel will pop up and you'll see all of those videos. JB will return in January, I believe, with this second part of the Abraham Lincoln series. So thank you all for joining for this series, and thanks to you, JB.